With former Homeland Security Secretaries Jay Johnson and Michael Chertoff. Gentlemen, I like being able to have you both here because you've both dealt with a very hard problem set. And so a lot of people have opinions, but you actually know what it's like to be in the job. So let me give you a really hard one, which is what to do about the southern border. In the last year, 2.5 million migrants roughly have been encountered. That is a record high. The governor of Texas is boasting that he's sent more than 13,000 immigrants to New York, to Chicago, to Washington, and now to Philadelphia, where busloads arrived this week. Secretary Chertoff, these migrants have legal status because they're going through asylum. Are the asylum laws too generous in this country?
Well, I mean, we can certainly take a look at the asylum laws, but generally we obey international law, which talks about the obligation to receive refugees. And in fact, now we have the issue of Ukrainians who are fleeing what is going on with the war in Ukraine. So certainly you can understand why people seek asylum. One of the things the administration has done, which I think is helpful, is they've moved the evaluation process down to those agents who are actually in the field to speed it up, to make sure you can determine whether there's a colorable claim, and if not, send people back. And they're also working to resource and streamline the process of making final adjudications. So that's all to the good, but it's not going to happen overnight. Also, I know the administration is working with nonprofits to create safe locations that people can stay while their claims are being adjudicated. I think stunts like what Governor Abbott has done really don't address the problem. They're simply a way of getting attention over the backs of people who are fleeing genuine crises in other parts of the world.
Because to get asylum, you need to show fear of persecution, torture because of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, other reasons. That's what these people did and were allowed in, just to be clear. Former Secretary Johnson, you know, one of the things the Biden administration just lost, though, is one of the tools they were using to turn people away. And over 1 million of those encounters I talked about people were expelled under Title 42, according to Customs and Border Protection. This was a pandemic era policy that said because of COVID, people didn't necessarily need to get in to the country. That goes away at the end of December. What then happens?
Well, first, Margaret, I have to be honest about the asylum laws and the processing. It takes 6 years right now to process an asylum claim once someone has entered this country. And one of the problems is that the bar to qualify initially and establish a case of credible fear is relatively low. Something like 70% of migrants qualify who seek it. And the ultimate qualification for asylum, the percentage there is only about 20%, and it's 6 years in between. Migrants know this, and so we've got to develop a system where we can more expeditiously deal with these claims, but also take a look at the credible fear standard itself. I know my friends on the left won't be too happy to hear that.
No politician's going to take that vote.
But it does exist, and it's a phenomenon. Well, it can be done possibly through regulation, and I think it's something that ought to be looked at. Now, in terms of Title 42, when CDC first announced in May that it was going to lift this, I and others were opposed to it. We thought there needed to be a more orderly transition. It is an extraordinary authority, and it's probably time now for it to go away in December. But the ability to send people back expeditiously, like the administration's been doing, needs to now be replaced with something else. And I think there the discussion is going to have to take place with Mexico to more expeditiously accept people back. We sent back something like 1.4 million last year, using in part Title 42. We need something to replace that. And I think working with the government of Mexico and frankly getting them to do more to step up on this is part of that answer.
I'd like for you both very quickly to weigh in on what happens if the Republican-led Congress goes ahead with this vow to impeach or try to impeach the current Secretary of Homeland Security. Does that mean all the things you suggested don't happen and Congress is just tied in knots? Secretary Chertoff?
Well, it would be a very sad day if in search of what is, again, a political stunt, threatening to impeach Secretary Mayorkas, Congress didn't do the things, for example, that Secretary Johnson just suggested. Maybe adjust the standard with respect to asylum, create more resources that are available to adjudicate, and work out additional ways to fund the effort to undermine the cartels and the smugglers, which are a big part of this. So it would be basically putting form over substance to go through a big performance on impeachment that's never going anywhere, rather than actually working with the administration to solve the problem.
And Secretary Johnson, I imagine you agree.
Margaret, what people need to know, and Michael and I know this, the Secretary of Homeland Security is focused on border security, maritime security, aviation security, cybersecurity, the Coast Guard, the Secret Service, and a host of other things. We can't have a secretary who's distracted by a stunt in Congress, an attempted impeachment.
All right. Thanks very much to both of you secretaries for weighing in. We'll be right back. We're back for more with Dr. Anthony Fauci. So the White House just asked Congress for another $10 billion in funding.
Yes.
We're technically still in the middle of a pandemic, even though the president said pandemic's over.
We really do need that money for any of a number of reasons, one of which is a practical thing of outreach and PSA campaigns to get people to be vaccinated. We have a long way to go to optimize our protection against COVID, which is really a shame, somewhat paradoxical that a rich country with all the vaccines that we need, and we're utilizing them at a much lower level than we should be.
I know you're planning to retire, and I asked you when you would feel comfortable retiring. And you said not until COVID's in the rear view mirror. You said when COVID doesn't dominate the mental framework of our society. What you're saying is we're choosing not to let it dominate our mental framework.
Well, exactly.
But it is still very much a risk.
It's still there. I mean, there's a difference, and that's an important point that I want to make. If you look at where we were a year ago at this time when Omicron started to surge, we were having 800 to 900,000 infections and 3,000 to 4,000 deaths. I don't like reading in the newspapers or getting my report from the COVID team. Today we lost 400 people. Today we lost 350 people. So it's much, much better than it was, but it is not at a level low enough where we should feel we're done with it completely, because we're not.
There have been all these House Republican calls for investigations into the origins of COVID and saying they're going to bring you up to Capitol Hill. Do you think that wanes as you step down?
Well, I don't think it's going to wane for me. The Republican House has said that they're going to, and that's fine with me.
You'll appear.
Oh, of course. I mean, I'm very much in favor of legitimate oversight. Absolutely. I mean, I've testified before Congress, given the 38 years that I've been director, literally hundreds of times in many oversight hearings.
It's never been this personal for you, though. And I know when I talked to you a year ago, you were angry. You said, I'm just going to do my job and I'm going to be saving lives, and they're going to be lying.
They've clearly politicized it. I'm not political at all, period. I've never been, and anybody who knows anything about me knows that that's the case. But it is very clear when people are running their campaigns with an anti-Fauci element to it. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, this is a public health issue. I'd be more than happy to explain publicly or otherwise everything that we've done, and I could defend and explain everything that we've done from a public health standpoint.
President Biden said the United States is asking China for more data about the origins. Have you seen anything that Beijing has produced?
No. You know, one of the problems is that, and this is historic, it goes way back to bird flu, the H5N1, the H7N9, the original SARS-CoV-1, that the Chinese, not necessarily the scientists that we know and we have dealt with and collaborated with productively for decades, but the whole establishment, a political and other establishment in China, even when there's nothing at all to hide, they act secretive, which absolutely triggers an appropriate suspicion of, like, what the heck is going on over there? So right now, what we would really like to know is all of the details of what went on with the original people who were infected. We keep a completely open mind as to what the origin is. Having said that, If you look at the examination by highly qualified international scientists with no political agendas, they've published in peer-reviewed journals that the evidence is quite strong that this is a natural occurrence. Does that mean we've ruled out that there was something funny going on at leak? Absolutely. And I and all of my colleagues keep an absolutely open mind. We've got to investigate every possibility because this is too important not to do that.
Have you seen anything that Beijing has produced at all in terms of explanation or data?
Well, their explanation is an explanation that they will not allow us to look at the primary information. The WHO went in and saw some of the data, some of which was actually quite helpful. But you know what we need, Margaret? We need a transparency and a collaboration to open things up so that we could discuss it in a non-accusatory way. What happens is that if you look at the anti-China approach that clearly the Trump administration had right from the very beginning, and the accusatory nature, the Chinese are going to flinch back and say, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to talk to you about it, which is not correct.
But they're not talking to the Biden administration about it either.
Exactly. I think that horse is out of the barn, and they're very suspicious of anybody trying to accuse them.
One of the other things that's interesting to us when we watch how the world deals with COVID is the zero COVID policy in China, where they shut down almost fully cities and things. And that impacts the global economy. It's why we're still dealing with this in many ways. Why hasn't Beijing been able to get a really effective vaccine? Why do they still struggle with this like that?
Well, it's the combination of not having an effective vaccine that they themselves made. It just is not nearly at the level of many of the other vaccines. It's just not, and that's unfortunate. And not wanting to bring in vaccines from the very beginning that were highly effective, 94, 95% effective.
Moderna
the Moderna, the Pfizer, as well as locking down almost without a purpose. When you put restrictions, you do it to give you time to be able to do something productive so you can unloosen or loosen up the restrictions. They, at least from what we were seeing, were just rigidly closing things down, which, unless you have a really, really good purpose of preparing yourself for opening, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
What do you plan to do after you leave NIH in December? What's next for you?
You know, I don't know, Margaret, and the reason I don't know is I want to strictly stick to the ethical guidelines of not negotiating what my next position, wherever that may be, in a university or in a foundation or in a whatever, until I actually step down. I want to continue to write and to lecture and utilize what I will have outside of a government position. What do I have? I have 54 years of experience as a scientist at the NIH. I have 38 years of experience leading the largest and most important infectious disease research institution in the world, and I've had the privilege of advising 7 presidents. I could use that experience, that know-how, that judgment to help others, to write about it, to lecture about it, and perhaps to encourage, at a time of anti-science, the best and the brightest among the young to at least consider a career in science, in public health, and importantly, in public service. If I can do that after I step down, I think that'll be, something that I would be pleased with.
We'll be watching. Dr. Fauci, thank you for your time today, and we'll be right back. We turn now to Colorado's Democratic Governor Jared Polis, who has stuck with us through some technical difficulties. And Governor, I understand you hear me now, so let's get straight to it. I'm sorry for what your state has recently gone through with this horrendous shooting at Club Q. It sounds like the shooter had a handgun and an AR-15 style rifle. Can you confirm that he legally purchased them, or were these unregistered ghost guns?
It has been reported that at least one of the guns was a ghost gun by different media outlets. All of these facts will emerge in the coming days and weeks. Obviously, right now, our heart is with the victims, 5 people who lost their lives, their families, dozens of others injured, and of course, many traumatized. Another example of a law that could have been used in this instance successfully is a red flag law, which we have in Colorado, but it's really up to the local law enforcement entity how to use it. In cases like this, where somebody can potentially be a danger and there are signs that they are a danger, we have a legal way to temporarily remove custody of any weapons they might have, and this is an example of a case where it might have been used.
Well, I want to ask you about that because President Biden said it was ridiculous that red flag laws are not being enforced just based on the knowledge of this shooter rather than relying on his or her parents. Is the president correct? And are you saying right now that your local law enforcement was choosing not to enforce the law?
So right now in Colorado, you can have parents or family members go for an extreme risk protection order or red flag law. That's fairly common. It wasn't pursued in this instance by the mother. You can also have a local sheriff agency do it. In this case, it wasn't pursued by the local sheriff agency. I'm sure what will be looked into is why wasn't it pursued. What I think we're going to look at in Colorado is potentially expanding that, for instance, so DAs can also seek extreme risk protection orders. We also need to make sure that we publicize the law and make sure that the tools are in people's hands when they need it to remove dangerous weapons that could be used for self-harm or harming others from somebody who's in a mental health crisis.
Mm-hmm. You said last week you didn't know yet if the shooter was motivated by anti-LGBTQ rhetoric or if it was a personal motive. Have you seen any evidence it was a hate crime? And does the fact that the shooter identifies as non-binary influence this in any way? Does this suggest anything to you?
Well, no, on the second point of the shooter's identity has nothing to do with whether a hate crime was committed or not. I want to be clear, in Colorado, if you kill 5 people, you're behind bars the rest of your life. This young man, once convicted, and I believe he will be convicted because the evidence is overwhelming, will never be able to be freed from a jail cell. He'll spend the rest of the day behind bars. The hate crimes on top of that can be used to augment the sentence. They can be used for acknowledging the fact that the LGBT community was traumatized. But again, the murder alone will send this person behind bars for the rest of his life.
Mm-hmm. The president has also renewed his call for an assault weapons ban. It sounds like the details of this case may be more complicated than that, if part of this was not a registered gun at all. In the past, you were against an assault weapons ban when you were in Congress back in 2013. You changed your position in 2018. Given that you're the chief executive of the state now, would you like to see an assault weapons ban?
Well, I would say, look, we learn from each instance, but you also have to look at all of the causes. So is there a way to improve gun safety out of this, to make sure that red flag laws are used? Not only if he had a pistol and a semi-automatic weapon, do we need better laws on ghost guns? Do we need to make sure that we have a better process around semi-automatic weapons? Open to all of those. We also need to pursue the mental health aspect of this and other shooting incidences. What and how did this fall through the cracks? We need to pursue the anti-LGBT rhetoric aspect of this. I think whether it'll be the case in this case or not, clearly the type of rhetoric out there that divides one group of Americans against another can set somebody over the top and tragically inspire them to an act of violence. We need to focus on national healing, bringing people together, and really treating one another as brothers and sisters.
I think people can agree, I hope, with at least that. Governor, thank you for your time today. And thank you for sticking with us through those technical difficulties and the delay that you all heard. We want to turn now to the war in Ukraine, where residents of Kherson are fleeing the city this weekend after sustained Russian bombardment knocked out power and water supplies. The latest in Moscow's effort to undermine Ukrainian morale after more than 9 months of brutal assault. CBS News foreign correspondent Chris Livesay is in Kyiv with this report.
Ukraine has already proven it can withstand the Russians. But what about the winter? At the front line, the cold and relentless artillery Maybe Russia's only hope to weaponize winter and freeze Ukraine's momentum.
Trenches like these become more and more commonplace the closer you get to the front line. And there's a really good reason for it. You don't just see and hear the flashes of artillery, but you can feel the thuds deep in your gut.
Ukrainians can also feel it right at their doorstep. Natalia Kristenko was coming home after drinking tea in Kherson. Medics, overwhelmed throughout a night of bombardment, didn't arrive until morning. Their city, only recently the scene of dancing after Russia's retreat, now limps through the dark and cold. Much like the capital Kyiv, the scene of a deadly missile attack this week. Ina and her son Artu have to shelter in a community tent.
We have no electricity and no water. Our phones and devices are out of battery. We do everything we can to distract Artur from what's really going on.
Kyiv's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, is fuming.
Right now, before the winter, the people, Putin and Russians want to let us be without electricity, without heating, without water. It's genocide. It's actually terrorism. The main goal of Russians to bring depression of society. I talk to the people, no negotiations with Russians. We, people is angry.
And the mayor says he never stops worrying about a nuclear disaster. In fact, the shelling has been so severe, the country had to disconnect all of its nuclear power plants temporarily. It was the first time in 40 years. Margaret?
Chris Lipsey, thank you. That's going to be it for us today. Thank you all for watching. And until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.